Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Amy Page and I'm with the State Capacity Building Center. We want to just take a moment to thank you for being with us today for our 30-minute Ask Me Anything session on using social media to enhance your web presence. This webinar is part of the larger consumer education webinar series being hosted by the State Capacity Building Center. Today we're going to walk through some questions that were posed during the national webinar on this topic from just last week. We know you may have additional questions as we go along, so we encourage you to put them in the chat box that you see to the right of the slides. And we will also have an opportunity to open up the line for any questions that you may have as we go along. The PowerPoint slides from the webinar last week will also be posted on the Consumer Education Webinar Series homepage, and we'll post a link to that page in the chat box in just a moment. There you will also find very informative resource guides that can help you enhance your consumer education website. I'd like to take just a moment. I'm very pleased that Alice Murray and Josh DeLong are joining us for today's webinar as well. So we look forward to their expertise as we go through some of the questions from last week's webinar and also revisit some of the highlights from the webinar. Before we get started, we wanted to learn a little bit more about who we have with us today on the call. So we have a quick poll for you to describe your role as it relates to this work around consumer education websites. You'll take just a moment to select the role that best fits you from the top, and if there isn't one, feel free to please choose other, and then you can use the chat box at the bottom to describe your role. Great, thank you so much. It looks like that we have quite a few program staff and state administrators, and then also I'm glad to see that we have a researcher and child care trainer on the call today as well. So again, welcome everyone, and we're glad you're here. We'd like to start off by asking Josh and Alice to respond to some questions that came up during our webinar last week. One of the first questions asked about what are a couple of tips for keeping social media content concise and effective? Alice, I'd like to ask for you your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I think that's a great question. A couple tips that we have for you to make sure that content you're putting out is really easy to understand and really eye-catching for your audience is to try avoid using acronyms in content. That can be really difficult when you work in a world where everyone understands what you mean when you use acronyms, but it's helpful to remember that not everyone will know what those letters stand for. It's also a good idea to try and avoid using stock photos that you see commonly in the digital space, especially some free stock photo sites. You'll notice that if you really pay attention to some ads that you might find targeted to you digitally, you might see those stock photos multiple times from multiple companies, entities, organizations. So if you can get creative with your photo use, that can help your content stand out. You can try and create some of your own visuals using some free content creation tools like Canva or Adobe for a more illustrated look, or just get creative with your photo search. When you're searching for a photo, think about using some unique key terms or scrolling down a couple of pages to make a unique selection. And I think a third tip that can be really helpful for people to consider is that shorter really is usually better. We've done a lot of research about this on various platforms, so it's easy to get lost in the platform rules and restrictions. But even if you're allowed to use more characters, if you can reread your post once you write it and try and cut out any unnecessary words or sentences, it can really help your audience stay engaged. So avoiding acronyms, trying to get creative with your photos and visuals, and keeping things short, I think, are our top 3 tips for effective content.
Great. Thanks so much, Alice. The next question, we want to talk about if states or territories are just establishing social media strategies or policies, what are some good resources for them to use as they begin crafting comment or posting policies as well as monitoring guidelines?
Yeah, that's another great question. We would definitely recommend putting thought into those things ahead of time. So it's great to get some examples, do some research as you're crafting those policies for yourself and your own social media presence. The social media resource guide or playbook is coming out soon, and that playbook does have links to a couple of example policies that could be a great place to start. If you want to see a few more examples as well, we'd really recommend looking at some of the major government accounts to see their structure and also the things that they choose to include. Think about some of the largest agencies like the CDC or even places like NASA have pretty fleshed out social media presence. And they will have policies in their About section on things like their Facebook page, or will also link to policies within bios on places like Twitter and Instagram. And you can get a sense of the types of things they're covering, as well as what types of language they're using to explain to people what the expectations are for their platform.
Wonderful. Very good information. Thanks, Alice. Josh, in thinking about social media strategies, how do you know if an objective is reasonable? For example, what would be a good example of a beginner's objective towards a big goal like increasing awareness of child care resources?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, and one that comes up quite a lot, Amy. So I'm glad that folks sent that one in. I think it sounds good, right? To say what are the industry benchmarks and go out and find somebody else's objectives and kind of set your goals around that. But ultimately, every organization is a little different, has different stakeholders and key audiences, and so I think. My advice is always those are good to kind of inform a general baseline, but benchmarking against where you are now, and then putting some key goals and objectives for progressive social media measurement beyond that is really the way to go. So it's more about are we improving over time, and I think as far as some starter objectives and what's reasonable, I don't think you have to get into what's our conversion rate and all those things immediately if you're just getting started. It's okay to kind of have some softer objectives and think about, okay, well, let's give ourselves some credit for putting ourselves out there and trying to learn about what kind of content is effective for us with our audience, and in what ways are they going to prefer to engage with us, and what really works well for that target audience. So looking at even targets for the number of partnerships with folks who are going to be pushing content out on social media for you and with you could be a good objective. Setting a target for consistently putting out a number of posts per month. I think that's one of the big things is that consistency and maintaining momentum. Sometimes we see folks go out there the first month, they're really excited, they put 20, 30 posts out on social media, they see some good metrics and payoff from that, and then the next month they get busy and they put 5 out and all those metrics drop off, and it's like, well, why did that happen? Was our content not effective? And the answer is no. Your overall sum of engagement, of course, is going to decrease the less that you do to some extent. So, consistency, targeting the number of posts that you put out there, learning from your own triumphs and mistakes. It can be an iterative goal of, are we beating what our top performing post was last year for posts that, or even last month, for posts that underperformed, did we learn lessons from those, and are we making tweaks to that content to go out and test it again with a different angle? And then finally, I think a good objective is just simply targeting additional reach, looking to grow your audience. when you're first getting started. At some point, engagement rates are really important. I mean, it's probably more important to get some good engagement from a smaller number of people than it is to get, a lot more eyeballs over time. You want to really have an audience that's engaged. But at the very beginning, when you're first starting out, your message isn't going to do any good unless you have some audience. And so that's often a good starter objective too, is let's grow our audience. If we're starting at 0 or we're starting at 100 or 500, can we grow that reach to reach 1,000 people next month or 2,000 people? What are some good ways to do that? What kind of content are we seeing month to month that's getting people to share our content so that we get exposed to more people who may be relevant members of our target audiences?
Thanks, Josh. This last question along the same lines talks a little bit about reporting. Do you have any recommendations for or examples of what good social media reports look like and what they have as part of the components of the report?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, what the report looks like, how it's formatted, those sorts of things, that's going to vary from organization to organization in terms of, who are you delivering it to, who are the stakeholders, and kind of what are some of their personal preferences. But to me, I think the most important thing is spend less time making a fancy report and locking all of your data into a PDF or something that's going to get thrown across the fence via email, and maybe nobody really reads the detail of it and gets the context behind it. So I think less time focusing on fancy reports and more time focusing on what are the data actually telling us month to month. And social media moves really, really fast, so we need data as close to real time as possible, and we need to quickly make adjustments that lead to improvements. And that's really more important than having, a detailed, wordy document, that we call a social media report or an analytics report. I think it's more important to look at kind of comparison periods. So, you got 100 likes on your post this month. That might not seem like a lot, but if you only had 20 last month, that's pretty good growth. Looking at, where can you see anomalies in the data and trends to make recommendations to change your procedures. When you started posting 3 times a week versus 2 times a week, did you see changes in your engagement numbers? Looking at simple ratios without getting too complicated, but how can you normalize some of your numbers? Maybe you want to see how much of your Instagram audience is engaging with each post. So dividing the post likes by your followers and tracking that ratio over time. So I think at the end of the day, to answer your question, it's not so easy to answer because every organization is going to have different things that they're measured on and different goals and objectives that are slightly unique to them over time. But I think that to answer the question of what a good social media report looks like, it doesn't really matter, I think, is the answer. You can have lots of data tables and things locked into a report, but what matters most is how are you contextualizing that data, and then who's going to be responsible for acting on it and going out to answer research questions, to test new things next month so that you're continuously improving. That's the important takeaway.
Great. Thanks so much to both of you for your responses to these questions. Before we open the line for any questions from those of you that are on the call, please remember to go ahead and type any additional questions you may have in the chat box at this time or as we go along. But we want to go ahead and take an opportunity to review some of the key takeaways from last week's webinar. So I'm actually going to turn it back over to Josh and Alice to hit some of the highlights.
Thanks, Amy. I think one of the key things that we covered in more detail last week was really just thinking about how this all comes together, and this is actually a great segue from talking about reporting, because when you're thinking about your goals and objectives, you really want to make sure that the strategies and tactics that you're deploying, the platforms that you're choosing, and the target audiences that you're looking at on social media, that those are aligned to the right goals and objectives. So this is a really simplified example, but what this matrix or this chart can show you is that there are different tactics here. So, using hashtags on Twitter, doing link posts on Facebook, posting a Facebook, a story to your Facebook account, doing a poll on Facebook or Twitter once a month. These sorts of strategies and tactics shouldn't just be kind of dreamed up arbitrarily, but they should be aligned to what are your actual objectives. So if you look at objective 2 here, for example, you want to increase your website traffic by 10% per month. Well, a hashtag alone probably isn't going to help do that. Posting a poll probably isn't going to help do that. But those link posts, right, and that's the orange dot that's mapped there, those are going to help you do that, right? If you post content on social media that links back to your website, chances are if that content is engaging and folks want to know more, they're going to click that link back to the website. And so you can see how the certain things that you want to achieve in terms of your objectives have to be really directly mapped to the type of content you're posting. It has to be pretty deliberate that you're posting the right type of content to meet that objective. So given that, I'll turn it over to Alice next to talk a little bit also more in depth about the highlights we covered last week on moderation procedures and some of the editorial calendar and accessibility concerns, and then I'll come back to talk a little bit more deeply about the reporting piece. So Alice?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so as we talked about a little bit in the initial Q&A, we do recommend that you take some time before you quote unquote go live on social media to set user expectations and sort of ease the burden of maintenance of social media by establishing some protocols for monitoring. So examples of things like that are creating a comment or post policy, like we talked about. You can find examples of these in some government accounts. Think about if your platform that you've chosen has a feature where you can receive direct messages. If so, you can often set up an automated response so that you don't have the burden of checking it every day. Your automated response could direct people to a web resource or give them a sense of when they should expect to hear back from you to set those user expectations. And you can create some internal documents as well, things just for your team, so that people can help people determine what should they be responding to and how should they be responding to it. The chart in the bottom here is a great example of something you can think through with your team. If a comment comes in, is it positive or negative in nature? Can I really add something to the conversation here, or would it be best if we ignored it and moved on? So thinking through those things can help you set yourself up for success and avoid scrambles later on down the line once you have a live page with a real audience. Another piece that you can think about ahead of time that can really start or help you before you start is thinking about your content. So we recommend that you build up at least a small library of content to go live on your page. And when you do that, you can think about the different types of content. So in addition to thinking through photo or video or Facebook or Instagram, we recommend that you think about this rule of thirds, which is sort of a common social media terminology that means that some of your posts might be promoting something, some of your posts might be interacting with your audience, and some of your posts might be sharing something with your audience or staying relevant in terms of what's happening in the greater world around them. So we think it's easier to think about having some messaging that is core to your mission, then building some community on your page, and then remaining timely. There's examples of all of these types of posts in the playbook that is being published soon if you want to dive a little bit more into that. But just a great thought starter to think about those content types and then think about how they can work together in a calendar. The bottom right shows you an example of a very simple calendar that we've made ourselves. You can make something similar that shows you when you're posting, what platform you're posting on, and maybe even what category of content from core messaging to timeliness that you'd want to post at what time. And doing this ahead of time helps you not have to come in every day and decide what goes live that day. And finally, last week, we talked a little bit about achieving accessibility with your social media content. This is really important in this new digital age to make sure that your content can be accessed by people who use screen readers or people who will need help digesting audio. There are a couple different ways to achieve accessibility on social media. There are some formal avenues, both through platforms, which means, Facebook itself, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or third-party tools, either add-ons or scheduling tools that you can use in addition to the platform. These tools often help you add things like alternative text to your images, which is text that a screen reader will pick up on and automatically read to the user to describe an image to them. And it's really just a matter of exploring the policies and how-to guides associated with all of those tools. In the event that those are hard to access, that the landscape changes and those aren't available to you, there are also some informal tactics that we recommend. You can make sure that your captions are really descriptive. Think about if you couldn't see the picture, would the caption still convey the message of your post? You could also include a description of the image within your caption, sort of an alt text alternative. So that's a great tip there too. In your captions, there's some best practices like using camel case in your hashtags, which means that you capitalize the first letter of every word. These are small things that can really help people pick up on what you're writing. We also recommend cross-posting, which means that if you do have a presence on more than one platform, you can try and make sure that the content you're posting on one platform is in some form also posted on the other platform. And that means that if someone has a hard time accessing Instagram content, maybe they'd be able to find your message on Facebook instead, a really good workaround. So again, there's more information about this coming out in the playbook, but these are some great things to think about for getting started with accessibility. Josh, I can pass it back over to you.
Okay, yeah, so continuing along the lines of talking about how all this feeds into reporting, I think this was something that we covered last week. It's a really great kind of simple look at the 5 kind of key steps that take place or should take place in that reporting process. You really think of it as you have your inputs from your social media content. That would be something like your Facebook post data or your Twitter analytics. The output is essentially, what's happening here, right? It's getting that collected data and information into some kind of format that you can report. Again, format's not so much important as just collecting the data and having it there. And then the important piece really comes into that third step, which is the insights. And so, impressions per day and engagement rates with posts, all that's great data to have, but it doesn't really tell you that much. It has to be in the context of how did that happen versus last week or last month or versus another type of post that we tried out. And so looking for those key insights is where the important piece towards action-oriented reporting really comes into play here. So for example, finding out that weekday posts garner more impressions than weekend posts, that's a great insight that you might be able to glean from your data. And then the action is, of course, that, next month let's stop posting on weekends. Let's only post on weekdays. The final outcome of that being that, oh, wow, we really increased our reach month over month because of that simple change that we made. So it's really about looking at the data, forming a hypothesis about why you're seeing what you're seeing, and then trying out some actions to see if they have the intended outcome. And then the final thing that we talked about last week that I'll cover is just to talk about some of the common constraints that come up when you're entering into the social media sphere. Not having time, staff, or budget. Those are all, common constraints that folks face. You may not have a full-time staff member, communications staff, or communications agency on board to manage all this stuff. But I think what Alice was referencing earlier in terms of preparing editorial calendars and some evergreen content, that being content that's kind of relevant year-round, having some of that stuff available in advance and kind of knowing what you're going to do when you're going to do it and scheduling it. A lot of the platforms actually allow you to schedule posts in advance. There are also third-party tools that will let you do that. All that stuff can really help with not having to think so much about the time aspect and automating some of the things that would normally be a constraint from a budget perspective. In terms of the analytics piece, If you don't have particular analytics tools built in to understand how social media is impacting, say, referrals to your website, or you don't have any other third-party tools in place, I think that's fine from a starting point. Because all of the platforms have native analytics and insights built into them anyway. So you can look at your Facebook insights or your Twitter analytics and at least download and export some of that basic data to inform your reporting and analysis. And then, of course, there are going to be state-specific constraints on social media. And, if that happens, maybe you're not allowed to engage with people online. Maybe you're not allowed to even start your own account focused around consumer education. A lot of times one of the most effective means of outreach in that case is to then leverage stakeholders and partners and provide them with content that's appropriate for social media, and see if you can amplify your message and your reach through some of those means as well. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it back over to Amy.
Great. Thanks so much, Josh and Alice, for hitting those highlights from last week's webinar. We'd like to take just a moment as we wrap up today's call to see if there are any questions from anyone on the line. Feel free to unmute yourself by pressing *6 if there's anyone that would like to ask a question of Josh and Alice related to social media. Again, it's *6 to unmute if anybody has any questions. We'll give it just another moment and we'll move on. Looks like we do have some folks typing in the chat box, so we will hold here for just a moment. Okay. That said, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we will go ahead, and we do have a couple of quick evaluation polls that we would like you to respond to. These are not tied to your registration in any way, so they are anonymous. We would appreciate if everyone would just take a moment to let us know how much your understanding of this topic has improved here on this first poll. Just another second to do that, and then we will switch over to one related to whether or not you will use these strategies. Great. Thank you so much for the responses. And again, this last poll is just asking how likely you are to use one of the strategies or practices that were discussed on today's call. Great. Thank you again for responding to those. We appreciate the feedback. We are going to switch back. We do have one remaining webinar in the current Hot Topics series, and that webinar is scheduled for December the 12th, and it is related to understanding your consumer education brand. The focus is really going to be on the impact that branding can have on your consumer education website. You will see a registration link there at the bottom of your slide right now. The registration links are also available on the Hot Topic Webinar Series webpage, and the link to that is in the chat box as well. So we hope that everyone can join us for that. In addition to that, there will be an Ask Me Anything follow-up scheduled the very following Thursday on December the 19th due to the holidays. So those two sessions will round out the current series of consumer education webinars. We are currently underway in thinking about the next round of webinar series that will begin probably late winter, early spring. And so on this poll, we would like for you to just respond if there are other webinar topics that you would find useful. Feel free to type those into the chat box here. Take just another moment. Okay, thank you. The information here on this slide has the links to where all of the consumer education website information is housed, and then you'll also find the links here on this slide for the resource guides and playbooks that are already established related to deciding websites that are accessible, search engine optimization, measuring web traffic and engagement, and then also improving consumer education websites with user research. And as Alice mentioned, we do have a playbook or resource guide that is coming soon related to social media. That is due to be posted on the webinar series webpage probably by mid-December. So please be on the lookout for that. We want to just take a moment to thank everybody for joining us today. We hope that you will participate in the next webinar session on December the 12th. If you have any questions following today's call, feel free to email us at capacitybuildingcenter@icf.com. That email address is there in the middle of your screen. Thanks again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.